Sometimes a woman reaches a point where she's tired of pretending her heart doesn't ache with loneliness, even when surrounded by everything money can buy. Sometimes that same woman finds the courage to walk across a dusty fairground and speak the truest words she's ever said to a complete stranger. In 1889, Miss Vivian Ashcroft did exactly that when she approached a towering cowboy named Bo Maddox and made a proposition that shocked everyone within earshot. She was wealthy, refined, and desperate for something real. He was poor, rough around the edges, and exactly what her family warned her against. When she asked him for strong sons, his answer wasn't what anyone expected. But what happens when a woman who's never been told no finally meets a man who sees straight through to her soul? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The September morning that would change everything began like any other in the grand Ashcroft mansion that overlooked Larkspur Junction. Vivian stood at her bedroom window, watching the steam rise from coffee cups and cooking fires throughout the bustling railroad town below. At 28, she possessed everything a woman of 1,889 was supposed to want. A fortune that could buy half the territory, an education that rivaled most men's, and a beauty that turned heads from the church steps to the cattle yards. Yet, as she twisted her mother's wedding ring around her finger, a nervous habit she'd developed since her mother's death 5 years prior, she felt as empty as the vast Montana sky, stretching endlessly beyond the Stu Mountains. The ring caught the morning light, its modest diamond a stark contrast to the elaborate jewelry her father now insisted she wear to social functions. Her mother, Catherine Ashcroft, had been a schoolteacher from a simple family when she'd captured Edmund Ashcroft's heart during his early prospecting days. The ring represented a time when love mattered more than social standing, when her parents had built something together with their bare hands rather than inheriting it from previous generations. Now it served as a daily reminder of what Vivian had never experienced, a partnership born of genuine affection rather than financial calculation. "Miss Vivian, your father requests your presence in the study," came the gentle voice of Rosa Martinez, the Mexican housekeeper who had raised Vivian after her mother's passing. Rosa's weathered hands carried a breakfast tray, but her dark eyes held the same concern they'd shown for weeks. At 60, Rosa possessed the wisdom of someone who had watched 3 generations of Ashcrofts navigate the treacherous waters of wealth and expectation. Vivienne turned from the window, smoothing the deep blue silk of her morning dress. "Another suitor, I suppose?" "Mr. Harrison Whitfield from Denver. Your father speaks of railroad investments and expansion opportunities." Rosa set the tray on the mahogany vanity, her tone carefully neutral. She had perfected the art of conveying disapproval without directly challenging the master of the house. The name Whitfield made Vivian's stomach tighten. She had met Harrison twice at territorial social gatherings, a thin, calculating man in his 40s who spoke of women as if they were livestock to be appraised and acquired. His first wife had died in childbirth, his second from pneumonia, and gossip suggested he was already interviewing candidates for the 3rd position. The thought of sitting through another breakfast while he discussed her breeding potential and his business prospects made her want to ride out into the wilderness and never return. "Tell me honestly, Rosa," Vivian said, settling at her vanity to pin up her auburn hair. "Do you think my mother would have chosen differently if she had known what her daughter's life would become?" Rosa moved around the room with practiced efficiency, straightening already perfect surfaces. "Your mother chose love, mija. She told me once that she would rather live in a cabin with a man who saw her soul than in a palace with one who saw only her face." The words stung because they highlighted exactly what Vivian lacked. Every man who courted her saw the Ashcroft name, the mining fortune, the social connections. They saw a broodmare for their dynasties and a trophy for their ambitions. Not one had ever asked about her thoughts on literature, her dreams of traveling beyond the territories, or her secret desire to use the family wealth for something meaningful rather than accumulating more of it. Edmund Ashcroft's study reflected the man himself, imposing, expensive, and designed to intimidate. Maps of mining claims covered one wall, while ledgers documenting the family's expanding wealth filled custom-built shelves. Behind his massive oak desk sat a man who had transformed himself from a poor Irish immigrant's son into one of the most powerful figures in the Montana Territory. At 55, Edmund retained the broad shoulders and calloused hands of his prospecting days, though his clothes now came from San Francisco's finest tailors. "Vivian, my dear, come sit." He gestured to the leather chair across from his desk, where Harrison Whitfield already occupied the matching seat. Whitfield rose with practiced courtesy, his pale eyes assessing her as if she were a prize heifer at auction. "Miss Ashcroft, you look radiant this morning," Whitfield said, his voice carrying the artificial warmth of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through charm when possible, force when necessary. Vivienne accepted his kiss on her gloved hand, while mentally cataloguing everything about him that made her skin crawl. His grip lasted a moment too long, his smile never reached his eyes, and he positioned himself to block her easy exit from the room. These were the calculated moves of a predator, refined by years of practice. "Harrison has been telling me about his expansion plans for the Denver and Rio Grande line," Edmund said, settling back into his chair with the satisfaction of a man arranging a profitable deal. "The partnership opportunities are quite promising." For the next hour, Vivienne sat in polite silence while the two men discussed her future as if she were a valuable asset to be transferred between portfolios. Whitfield spoke of the advantages of combining their railroad and mining interests, the social prominence she would enjoy in Denver society, and the fine, strong children their union would produce. Edmund nodded approvingly, occasionally glancing at his daughter to ensure she maintained the appearance of interested compliance. When Whitfield finally departed with promises to continue their courtship at the upcoming county fair, Vivienne remained in her chair, staring at the map of mining claims that represented her father's life work. "He's a good man, Vivienne," Edmund said, misreading her silence as contemplation rather than revulsion. "Established, connected, capable of providing you with everything you deserve." "Everything except affection," she replied quietly. Edmund's expression hardened. "Affection is a luxury, daughter. Security and respect are necessities. Your mother understood that." "My mother married for love," Vivienne countered, touching the wedding ring beneath her gloves. "Your mother married a poor prospector with nothing but hopes and determination," Edmund corrected. "I became successful enough to give her comfort and you opportunities. Love alone doesn't put food on the table or secure a family's future." The conversation ended there, as it always did, with Edmund's practical worldview crushing any romantic notions like ore beneath a mining stamp. Vivienne excused herself and walked through the mansion's opulent rooms, feeling like a ghost haunting someone else's life. That afternoon, she rode her mare through the streets of Larkspur Junction, observing the town her family's wealth had helped build. The railroad brought constant streams of prospectors, merchants, and settlers, all chasing their own versions of the American dream. The main street bustled with activity: the general store, the bank where her father held considerable influence, the hotel where visiting businessmen negotiated deals that would shape the territory's future. At the edge of town, she paused near the construction site where workers were building the grandstand for the county fair. In 3 days, the entire region would gather for the annual celebration that marked the end of harvest season and the beginning of the long Montana winter. There would be competitions, dancing, and the inevitable parade of eligible bachelors hoping to catch her attention or her father's approval. As she watched the workers, genuine men whose hands bore the honest calluses of physical labor, Vivienne felt a sudden, overwhelming desire for something real. She wanted to matter to someone for reasons that had nothing to do with her bank account. She wanted to build something meaningful rather than simply inheriting it. Most of all, she wanted to feel alive in a way that had nothing to do with social expectations or family obligations. The county fair would bring together people from ranches and homesteads scattered across hundreds of miles. Among them would be men who had never heard the Ashcroft name, who wouldn't calculate her worth in mining claims and railroad stocks. Perhaps, in that crowd of honest folk, she might find someone who could see past the silk and jewels to the woman underneath. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Vivian made a decision that would have shocked her father and scandalized Denver society. She would attend the fair, not as the dutiful daughter seeking an appropriate match, but as a woman determined to find something genuine, even if it meant abandoning everything she had been taught about her place in the world. The wedding ring on her finger seemed to warm against her skin, as if her mother's spirit approved of the choice. For the first time in years, Vivian felt a flutter of genuine anticipation rather than resigned dread about her future. She had no way of knowing that in 3 days she would walk across a dusty fairground and speak words that would echo through Larkspur Junction for generations to come. She couldn't foresee that her desperate search for something real would lead her to a quiet giant of a man whose answer would change not just her life, but everything she thought she knew about love, courage, and what it truly meant to build a legacy worth leaving behind. The 3rd day of October arrived with the crisp promise of autumn and the excited energy that always surrounded the Larkspur Junction County Fair. By noon, the temporary town that had sprung up around the fairgrounds teemed with families from ranches and homesteads scattered across 3 territories. The air carried the mingled scents of roasting corn, wood smoke, and the earthy smell of livestock waiting for judging. Vivian had dressed carefully in an emerald green riding dress that was elegant but practical, with boots sturdy enough for walking on uneven ground. She'd left her jewelry at home, except for her mother's wedding ring, wanting nothing to mark her as different from the other women enjoying the festivities. Rosa had braided her auburn hair in a simple style that wouldn't come undone in the afternoon breeze. The fair bustled with genuine joy that felt foreign after years of stiff social gatherings. Children chased each other between the booths, while their mothers compared preserves and quilts. Men gathered around the livestock pens, debating the merits of different breeding stock with the serious intensity of experts. There was laughter here, real and unguarded, the kind that came from people who worked hard and took their pleasures honestly. Near the main platform, Harrison Whitfield held court with a group of territorial officials and their wives, his voice carrying as he expounded on railroad expansion plans. He caught sight of Vivian and raised his hat with the presumptuous familiarity of a man who believed their engagement was merely a formality waiting for the proper announcement. She turned away quickly, seeking escape in the crowd. The timber-pulling competition had drawn a substantial audience to the far end of the fairgrounds. This was a test of pure strength and technique, where men competed to drag massive logs across measured distances, using nothing but rope and determination. The current leader was a weathered rancher named McCullough, who had managed to pull a 1,000-pound log nearly 30 feet before his strength gave out. Then she saw him. Bo Maddox stood at the edge of the competition area, studying the logs with the calm assessment of a man who understood exactly what the task demanded. He towered over every other competitor, standing well over 6 feet, with shoulders that stretched the seams of his worn cotton shirt. His dark hair needed cutting, and several days of stubble shadowed his strong jaw. There was something about his stillness that drew attention, not the aggressive posturing of men trying to intimidate their rivals, but the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove to anyone. His hands fascinated her. Even from a distance, she could see they were scarred and calloused from years of honest work. Yet he held the heavy rope with surprising gentleness, as if he understood that brute force alone wouldn't win this competition. When he removed his worn leather gloves and tucked them carefully into his belt, the gesture spoke of a man who took care of his possessions because he couldn't easily replace them. "That's Bo Maddox," said a voice beside her. She turned to find Mrs. Patterson, the blacksmith's wife, following her gaze with obvious approval. "Quiet fellow, but there's not a harder worker in the territory. Helped my husband shoe horses all summer. Never asked for more than fair wages and a decent meal." "Does he have family nearby?" Vivian asked, trying to sound casually interested. "None that I know of. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's got a good reputation. Honest as the day is long, and strong as an ox." Mrs. Patterson chuckled. "Half the unmarried ladies in 3 counties have set their caps for him, but he doesn't seem interested in settling down." When Beau's turn came, the crowd quieted with anticipation. He approached the largest log, one that had defeated the previous 2 competitors entirely. At nearly 1,200 pounds, it represented a challenge that bordered on impossible. He knelt beside it, running his hands along the wood to check for rough spots that might tear the rope, then positioned himself with the careful precision of a man who had done this kind of work before. The moment he began to pull, Vivienne understood why the other women watched him with such obvious admiration. His movements combined raw power with controlled technique, his body finding the perfect angle to maximize leverage while minimizing wasted effort. Sweat darkened his shirt as he gained inch by precious inch, his boots digging furrows in the packed earth. The crowd held its collective breath as he passed McCullough's mark, then erupted in cheers as he continued another 10 feet before finally releasing the rope. As the judges measured his pull and declared him the winner, Beau accepted the congratulations of his fellow competitors with quiet grace. He pulled his gloves back on with the same careful attention he'd shown in removing them, then collected his modest prize money with a polite nod to the officials. There was no showboating, no victory dance, just the satisfaction of a job well done. Something about his self-contained dignity called to everything Vivienne had been missing in her life. Here was a man who didn't need validation from others, who found his worth in honest accomplishment rather than inherited privilege. The thought of him going back to his solitary life while she returned to fending off the advances of men like Harrison Whitfield suddenly seemed unbearable. Before she could lose her nerve, she began walking toward him. The crowd around the competition area was beginning to disperse when she approached. Beau had stepped aside to let a young boy examine his prize ribbon, explaining with patient kindness how the competition worked. Up close, he was even more impressive than just his size, but the quiet intelligence in his storm-grey eyes and the gentle way he spoke to the excited child. When he noticed her standing nearby, he straightened to his full height and touched the brim of his hat respectfully. "Ma'am." For a moment, her carefully rehearsed words deserted her entirely. Standing before this man who represented everything genuine and strong that was missing from her world, she felt suddenly fragile and false in her fine clothes and educated speech. "Mr. Maddox," she managed, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "That was quite impressive." "Thank you, ma'am. Just doing what needs doing." His voice carried the slight roughness of a man who didn't waste words on empty pleasantries. Around them, she could feel other fairgoers beginning to notice their conversation. A woman of her obvious station speaking privately with a working man would draw attention and speculation. The awareness that she was crossing an invisible but very real social boundary only strengthened her resolve. "I wonder if I might speak with you privately," she said, "about a matter of mutual benefit." Something shifted in his expression. Not suspicion exactly, but a careful wariness that suggested he'd had experience with the complications that could arise from private conversations with wealthy women. "I reckon that would depend on the matter, ma'am." She took a breath that seemed to draw in all the courage she'd never known she possessed. "I'm Vivienne Ashcroft. I have a proposition for you." He knew the name, of course. Everyone in the territory knew the Ashcrofts. But instead of the deference or calculation she usually saw when men learned her identity, his expression remained professionally neutral. "I'm listening." The words came out in a rush before she could question their wisdom. "I want you to give me strong sons." The reaction was immediate and electric. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as heads turned toward them. Someone dropped a cup, the sound sharp in the sudden silence. A woman gasped audibly, while a man muttered something about shameless behavior under his breath. Beau Maddox didn't blink. He studied her face with those steady grey eyes, taking in her flushed cheeks and raised chin, the way she held herself as if braced for battle. When he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that only she could hear it over the growing murmur of shocked spectators. "That's quite an offer, Miss Ashcroft, but I'm thinking you might want more than just sons." "What do you mean?" He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the clean scent of soap and honest sweat, close enough to see the flecks of silver in his grey eyes. When he leaned down to speak directly into her ear, his voice carried a warmth that made her shiver. "I'll give you more than sons, ma'am. I'll give you a life you'll feel in your bones." The words hit her like a physical force, promising things she hadn't even known she wanted. A life she could feel, not just observe from the safety of inherited wealth, but truly experience with all the joy and pain and authentic connection she'd been missing. "When can we discuss the details?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tomorrow, sunset, the old oak at the edge of your property." He straightened, touching his hat brim again. "Good day, Miss Ashcroft." As he walked away with that same unhurried stride she'd first noticed, Vivienne became aware of the dozens of eyes watching her every movement. The whispers had begun, spreading through the crowd like wildfire. By evening, everyone in the territory would know that the Ashcroft heiress had propositioned a cowboy at the county fair. Harrison Whitfield appeared at her elbow, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Vivienne, what in God's name were you thinking? The entire territory just watched you make a spectacle of yourself with a common laborer." She turned to face him with a calmness that surprised them both. "I was thinking, Mr. Whitfield, that it's past time I started making my own choices about my future." His grip on her arm tightened uncomfortably. "Your father will hear about this. There will be consequences." "I'm counting on it," she replied, pulling free of his grasp. As she walked toward her carriage, past the staring faces and whispered speculation, Vivienne felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The exhilarating terror of having burned her bridges and committed herself to an unknown future. Tomorrow at sunset, she would meet Beau Maddox and discover whether his promise of a life she could feel in her bones was something he could actually deliver. The wedding ring on her finger seemed to pulse with warmth, as if her mother's spirit approved of her daughter finally having the courage to reach for something real. The storm that greeted Vivienne when she returned home that evening exceeded even her expectations. Edmund Ashcroft stood in the mansion's marble foyer like an avenging patriarch, his face dark with the kind of rage she'd only seen when business deals went catastrophically wrong. Harrison Whitfield sat in the parlor beyond, nursing a whiskey with the wounded dignity of a man whose property had been publicly insulted. "Explain yourself," Edmund demanded without preamble. "Harrison tells me you made some sort of indecent proposal to a vagrant at the fair." "Beau Maddox is hardly a vagrant, father. Mrs. Patterson speaks very highly of his character and work ethic." "His character?" Edmund's voice rose dangerously. "You publicly propositioned a man who probably can't read his own name, and you want to discuss his character." Rosa appeared in the hallway, ostensibly dusting surfaces that were already spotless, but her presence offered a small measure of comfort. The older woman had weathered many of Edmund's storms and knew when to provide silent support. "I offered him employment," Vivienne said carefully, "nothing more." "Employment doing what exactly?" Harrison interjected from the parlor doorway. "Because half the territory heard you ask him to father your children." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gunpowder blast. Vivienne felt her cheeks burn, but she refused to lower her eyes or offer the apology they expected. "My words may have been poorly chosen, but my intentions were practical. The homestead property has been sitting idle for 3 years. It needs someone with the skills to make it productive again." This was partially true. The Ashcroft homestead sat on 200 acres of good grazing land, an hour's ride from town, complete with a sturdy house, barn, and outbuildings. Edmund had purchased it from a family moving west, intending to use it for agricultural experiments that had never materialized. Now it served as little more than a symbol of wealth-gathering dust. "You want to hire a ranch hand," Edmund said slowly, "and your method was to ask him to give you strong sons." "I misspoke in the heat of the moment. You humiliated yourself and our family name," Harrison snapped. Do you have any idea what people are saying? The daughter of Edmund Ashcroft behaving like a common trollop, throwing herself at the first man who caught her fancy. The insult sparked something dangerous in Vivienne's chest. Better to throw myself at an honest man than to be sold to one like a prized mare. The slap came without warning, Harrison's palm connecting with her cheek in a sharp crack that echoed through the foyer. Rosa gasped and started forward, but Edmund's raised hand stopped her. "You will apologize to Mr. Whitfield immediately," Edmund commanded, his voice deadly quiet. Vivienne touched her stinging cheek, tasting blood where her teeth had cut the inside of her mouth. The pain clarified her thinking in a way that years of gentle pressure and social expectations had not. She understood with crystalline certainty that this moment would define the rest of her life. She could submit to their vision of her future, or she could fight for the possibility of something better. "No," she said simply. The word seemed to hang in the air like a challenge thrown down between armies. Edmund's face went white, then red, cycling through the colors of a man discovering that his most valuable asset had developed a will of its own. "You will apologize, and you will marry Harrison within the month, or you will find yourself cut off from this family entirely. No inheritance, no support, no connection to the Ashcroft name." "Edmund," Rosa said quietly, the first time Vivienne had ever heard her address her father, without the respectful "Signor. Perhaps we should discuss this when tempers have cooled." "Stay out of this, Rosa," Edmund snapped, but his tone lacked its usual authority. The threat he'd just made was more serious than a moment of anger. It was the nuclear option that could destroy his daughter's life entirely. Vivienne straightened her shoulders, drawing on reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed. "I'll need time to consider your ultimatum, father. In the meantime, I believe I'll take a closer look at the homestead property. As you said, it's been idle too long." She left them standing in the foyer and walked upstairs with measured steps, her spine straight and her head high. Only when she reached her room did she allow herself to collapse into the chair by her window, shaking with the magnitude of what she'd just set in motion. The next evening, she rode out to the old oak that marked the boundary of the homestead property. The ancient tree stood on a small rise that offered views across the valley, its massive trunk scarred by decades of Montana weather, but still strong and enduring. As the sun painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, she saw a familiar figure approaching on foot. Bo Maddox moved through the landscape as if he belonged to it, his long stride covering ground efficiently without seeming hurried. He'd cleaned up since the fair, his shirt was fresh, his hair combed back, and he'd shaved the stubble that had shadowed his jaw. The changes only emphasized the natural dignity that had first caught her attention. "Miss Ashcroft," he said, touching his hat as he approached. "I wasn't certain you'd come." "I keep my appointments, Mr. Maddox, regardless of the circumstances that follow them." Something in her tone made him study her face more carefully, and she realized he could probably see the faint bruise on her cheek, despite her attempts to cover it with powder. "I hope those circumstances weren't too unpleasant," he said quietly. "Nothing I didn't expect." She dismounted from her horse, needing to be on the same level for this conversation. "I have a proposition for you, Mr. Maddox. A legitimate business arrangement this time, with terms that might benefit us both." He listened without interruption, as she explained about the homestead property, its current state of disrepair, and her need for someone with the skills to make it productive. She spoke of wages, living arrangements, and the work that would need to be done before winter set in. Throughout her presentation, his grey eyes never left her face, as if he were reading meanings between her carefully chosen words. "It's good land," he said when she finished. "I rode past it a few times over the years. The house has good bones, and the water rights are solid. A man could build something worthwhile there, given time and effort." "Then you're interested?" "I'm curious about why you'd trust such a project to a man you met yesterday, Miss Ashcroft, and I'm wondering what you really hope to gain from this arrangement." The directness of his question deserved an honest answer, even if it revealed more than she'd intended to share. "I want to build something real, Mr. Maddox, something that exists because of effort and intention rather than inheritance and social expectation. I want to prove to myself and my family that I'm capable of more than playing the role of a decorative daughter. And if your family objects to this arrangement, then I'll face those consequences when they come." Bo was quiet for a long moment, studying the valley spread out below them. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of a man who had learned to read character through hard experience. "I'll work your land, Miss Ashcroft, but I have conditions of my own. I work for you, not your father or any other man who thinks he has a claim on your decisions. If you want to learn what needs doing, I'll teach you, but I won't do the work while you watch from a safe distance. And if this arrangement becomes more complicated than honest labor for honest wages, I'll walk away without looking back." "Agreed," she said immediately. They shook hands on the deal, his calloused palm warm and solid against hers. The contact lasted perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary, long enough for her to notice the strength in his grip and the steadiness of his gaze. "I can start tomorrow," he said. "The barn needs the most urgent attention before the weather turns." As they parted ways, Vivienne felt a lightness in her chest that had nothing to do with the evening breeze. For the first time in her adult life, she had made a decision based on her own judgment rather than the expectations of others. Whatever came next, she would face it as the author of her own choices rather than a passive recipient of others' plans. The deed to the homestead property lay in her father's safe, but she had learned enough about the family business to know that legal ownership could be transferred. If Edmund carried through on his threat to disown her, she would need something more substantial than moral victories to sustain her future. As she rode home through the gathering darkness, Vivienne began to understand that hiring Bo Maddox was only the first step in a much larger transformation. She was preparing to abandon the world she'd been born into for one she would have to build from scratch, and the man who had promised to give her a life she could feel in her bones would be her partner in that audacious undertaking. The first morning Vivienne arrived at the homestead, she found Bo already at work in the barn, his shirt sleeves rolled up as he examined the sagging roof beams with professional attention. The October air carried a crisp promise of winter, and she could see her breath as she approached the weathered structure that would become the center of their shared project. "You're early," she observed, noting that the sun had barely cleared the mountains. "Light's precious this time of year, we jombi doos, in W. Granger," he replied, without looking up from his assessment of a particularly troublesome beam. "We'll need every hour we can get if we want this place ready before the snow flies." She had dressed practically in one of her oldest riding skirts and a wool jacket, but she still felt overdressed compared to his worn work clothes and sturdy boots. The realization that she owned nothing suitable for actual physical labor struck her as both embarrassing and symbolic of how removed she'd been from the real work of living. "What can I do to help?" This time he did look at her, taking in her expectant expression and impractical attire with what might have been amusement. "Can you cook, Miss Ashcroft?" "I can manage breakfast," she said, though her experience was limited to the simple meals Rosa had taught her during childhood visits to the kitchen. "Then I'd be grateful for coffee, and whatever else you can manage. I brought supplies in my saddlebags." She found his provisions in the cabin: coffee beans, bacon, eggs, and bread wrapped in oiled cloth. The kitchen was basic but functional, with a wood-burning stove that took her several frustrating minutes to light properly. As she worked, she could hear the steady rhythm of his hammer outside, already beginning the repairs that would make the barn weatherproof. When she called him in for breakfast, Bo surveyed the slightly burned bacon and uneven eggs with diplomatic silence before taking his first bite. "It's good," he said, and she suspected he would have said the same thing, regardless of the actual quality. "You don't have to lie to spare my feelings," she replied, settling across from him at the simple wooden table. "I'm aware my domestic skills need improvement." "Most skills improve with practice," he said mildly. "The willingness to try is what matters most." They ate in comfortable silence, broken only by the sound of wind rattling the cabin's windows and the distant call of geese heading south for winter. The simplicity of the moment, sharing a humble meal with a man who valued honest effort over social graces, felt more genuine than any of the elaborate dinner parties she'd attended in recent memory. "Tell me about the work that needs doing," she said as they finished eating. Bo pulled a piece of paper from his shirt pocket, covered with notes written in surprisingly neat handwriting. "The barn roof is the priority. Won't do any good to store hay or shelter livestock if everything gets soaked. After that, we need to check the well pump, repair the fence lines, and cut enough firewood to last the winter. And the house? Structurally sound, but it needs attention too. Some of the windows don't close properly, the chimney needs cleaning, and we should check the root cellar for winter storage." The list seemed overwhelming, but his matter-of-fact delivery suggested he'd tackled similar challenges before. As she watched him study his notes, she noticed the care he took with his possessions. The paper was creased but clean, his handwriting economical but legible, his pencil sharpened to a precise point. "Where did you learn carpentry?" she asked. "My father was a cabinet maker back in Missouri before the war changed everything. He taught me that if you're going to build something, you build it to last." Bo folded the paper carefully and returned it to his pocket. "What about you, Miss Ashcroft? What skills are you hoping to learn out here?" The question caught her off guard with its assumption that she had genuine intentions beyond playing at frontier life. "I want to understand how things actually work. How to make something productive rather than just owning it." "That's a worthy goal," he said simply, and she felt a warm flush of pride at his approval. Over the following days, they fell into a routine that felt surprisingly natural. Vivienne arrived each morning with supplies and attempted breakfast, while Bo tackled the more demanding physical tasks. She proved unexpectedly useful at holding boards steady while he hammered, mixing mortar for the chimney repairs, and organizing the tools that had accumulated in random corners of the barn. The work was harder than anything she'd ever attempted, leaving her hands blistered and her muscles aching in places she hadn't known existed. But alongside the physical discomfort came a satisfaction that had been entirely missing from her previous life. When they finished repairing a section of fence or successfully replaced a broken window, she felt the deep contentment that came from solving real problems with tangible solutions. Bo proved to be a patient teacher, explaining techniques without condescension and offering gentle corrections when she made mistakes. When she struggled to drive a nail straight, he showed her how to hold the hammer differently. When she couldn't get the wood stove to draw properly, he demonstrated the relationship between airflow and fire management. His knowledge seemed to encompass everything from animal husbandry to weather prediction, acquired through years of practical experience rather than formal education. On the fourth afternoon, as they took a break from splitting firewood, Vivienne carved a simple wooden spoon from a piece of scrap pine. The project had started as a way to rest her aching back, but under Bo's guidance, it evolved into something surprisingly functional and even elegant in its simplicity. "You have good hands for this work," he observed, watching her smooth the spoon's bowl with careful sandpaper strokes. "It's more satisfying than I expected," she admitted, "creating something useful from raw materials." "That's the difference between building and buying," Bo said. "When you make something yourself, it carries a piece of your intention. Every meal you eat with that spoon will remind you that you're capable of more than you knew." The insight struck her as profoundly true. The spoon represented her first successful creation, proof that she could contribute something meaningful to their shared project. She wrapped it carefully in her handkerchief, planning to take it home as a tangible reminder of what she was learning about herself. That evening, as they shared another of her gradually improving meals, the conversation turned to more personal topics. Bo asked about her education, her travels, the books she'd read. In return, she learned about his years of wandering after the war, the various jobs that had brought him to Montana, and his dream of eventually owning land where he could raise horses. "You could do that here," she said impulsively. "The pasture land is perfect for horses, and there's always demand for good stock." "It's your land, Miss Ashcroft, not mine." "It could be shared," she said, then felt her cheeks warm at the implications of the suggestion. Bo studied her face in the lamplight, those steady grey eyes seeming to read thoughts she hadn't fully formed herself. Is that what you want from this arrangement? A partnership that extends beyond employer and hired hand? The directness of his question demanded an equally honest answer. I don't know what I want, Mr. Maddox, but I know I've never felt more myself than I have these past few days. Working beside you, learning from you, building something that matters, it feels like the life I was meant to live. And your family, your father's expectations? My father has given me an ultimatum. Marry Harrison Whitfield within the month, or lose everything connected to the Ashcroft name. That's a hard choice to face. It would be, if I hadn't already made my decision, she said quietly. I'd rather have nothing with the possibility of building something real than have everything while living someone else's vision of my life. Beau reached across the table and covered her hand with his own, the gesture gentle but unmistakably significant. Then we'd better make sure we build something worth the sacrifice. The warmth of his touch and the promise in his words sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the evening chill. As they sat together in the simple cabin, surrounded by the tools and evidence of their shared work, Vivienne felt the first stirrings of something deeper than partnership, a connection that might eventually grow into the kind of love her mother's letters had described. When he walked her to her horse at the end of the evening, his hand lingered on hers as he helped her mount. The contact was brief, but electric, carrying the weight of possibilities neither had yet dared to speak aloud. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked. "I'll be here," she promised, and knew that the words carried more meaning than a simple commitment to show up for work. As she rode home through the star-filled darkness, the wooden spoon tucked safely in her jacket pocket seemed to pulse with warmth against her ribs, a tangible reminder that she was finally learning to build rather than simply inherit her future. 3 weeks into their arrangement, Vivienne found herself in the mansion's dusty attic, searching through trunks of family belongings she hadn't examined in years. Rosa had mentioned seeing some of her mother's personal effects stored there, and something about the deepening connection with Beau made her want to understand more about the woman who had chosen love over social expectation decades earlier. The trunk sat in a corner beneath a sheet that had once been white, but now bore the grey patina of neglect. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that crackled with age, she found her mother's wedding dress, a simple but elegant gown of ivory silk that would have been considered modest even by the standards of 30 years ago. Beneath it lay a wooden box containing jewelry, photographs, and what appeared to be a bundle of letters tied with faded blue ribbon. Her hands trembled as she untied the ribbon and opened the first letter. The paper was cream-colored and expensive, but the handwriting was her father's, though younger and somehow more vulnerable than the confident script she knew from business documents. "My dearest Catherine," the letter began, "I know a man of my rough background has no right to court a woman of your refinement and education, but I find myself unable to think of anything else since we met at the church social last Sunday." The letters painted a picture of courtship that bore no resemblance to the cold, practical marriage she'd observed between her parents in later years. Her father's words revealed a man desperately in love, offering his beloved everything from hand-picked wildflowers to promises of a future built on shared dreams rather than social obligations. "I may never have much to offer in terms of fine houses or fancy clothes," one letter read, "but I swear to you that every day of our life together will be filled with the kind of love that makes a woman feel cherished for who she is, not what she represents." Her mother's responses were equally passionate, describing her decision to accept his proposal despite her family's strong objections. "They tell me I'm throwing away my future for a man who will never give me the security I deserve," Catherine had written, "but they don't understand that real security comes from being loved completely, not from being provided for grudgingly." The later letters chronicled their early married life, the struggles of establishing Edmund's mining claims, the joy of Vivienne's birth, and the gradual transformation of passionate love into something deeper and more enduring. But as the years progressed, the tone began to shift. Business success brought new responsibilities and social pressures. Edmund's letters became shorter and more focused on practical matters, while Catherine's responses revealed growing loneliness as her husband became increasingly absorbed in building his empire. The final letter in the bundle was dated just months before Catherine's death. In it, she wrote to a sister back east, "I fear Edmund has forgotten the man he was when he courted me with such beautiful words. Success has hardened him in ways I didn't expect, and I sometimes wonder if he sees me as another acquisition rather than the woman he once claimed he couldn't live without. I pray that Vivienne will have the courage to choose differently when her time comes." Vivienne sat back on her heels, the letter still clutched in her hands. The parallel between her mother's situation and her own was both heartbreaking and illuminating. Catherine had chosen love over social expectation, just as Vivienne was contemplating, but that choice had eventually been complicated by the very success it had helped to create. "Miss Vivienne," Rosa's voice called from the bottom of the attic stairs, "your father is asking for you in his study." She carefully returned the letters to their ribbon binding and made her way downstairs, her mind still processing the revelation of her parents' early relationship. The contrast between the passionate young man in those letters and the stern patriarch waiting in the study seemed almost impossible to reconcile. Edmund stood at his window, looking out over the town his wealth had helped to build. His shoulders carried the weight of years and responsibility, and for the first time in her adult life, Vivienne saw him not just as an obstacle to her happiness, but as a man who had perhaps lost something precious in the process of gaining everything else. "Harrison tells me you've been spending considerable time at the old homestead," he said without turning around. "I've been overseeing the restoration work. It's proceeding well. With this Maddox fellow serving as your foreman, I assume." "Among other duties, yes." Edmund finally turned to face her, and she was surprised to see something that looked almost like sadness in his expression. "Vivienne, I need you to understand something about the world we live in. A woman of your station has certain responsibilities that extend beyond personal preference. Your marriage isn't just about your individual happiness. It affects business relationships, social standing, and the security of everyone who depends on the Ashcroft name. The way Mother's marriage affected those things when she chose to marry a poor prospector." The question hit its mark. Edmund's carefully controlled expression flickered, revealing a man who hadn't expected his daughter to know about his humble beginnings or his wife's sacrifice in accepting his proposal. "Your mother's situation was different," he said finally. "I had prospects, ambition, and the determination to provide her with everything she deserved. And you did provide for her, father. But did you love her the way you promised in your letters?" Edmund went very still. "What letters?" "The ones where you swore to cherish her for who she was rather than what she represented." For a long moment, father and daughter regarded each other across the gulf of years and misunderstanding. Edmund's face cycled through surprise, pain, and finally a resignation that seemed to age him before her eyes. "You found them in the attic," he said quietly. "I wondered what had happened to Catherine's personal effects." "She kept every letter you wrote during your courtship. They're beautiful, father. They show a man capable of the kind of love she wrote about in her own correspondence." Edmund moved to his desk and sank into the leather chair, as if his legs could no longer support him. "I was a different man then. Poorer, but perhaps richer, in ways that mattered more." "What changed?" "Success, I suppose. Responsibility. The weight of providing for a family and maintaining the respect I'd fought so hard to earn." He looked at his hands, still calloused, despite years of wearing fine gloves. "Your mother deserved security, and I was so determined to give it to her that I perhaps forgot she'd married me for reasons that had nothing to do with financial stability." The admission hung between them like a bridge Vivienne had never expected to see built. For the first time, she understood that her father's rigid expectations might stem from regret rather than mere stubbornness. "It's not too late," she said gently, "to remember who you were when you wrote those letters." "Perhaps not for me," Edmund agreed. "But I won't see you make the mistakes I made in reverse. Your mother chose love over security and spent her later years watching me become someone she barely recognized." You're contemplating choosing a man with no prospects over one who can provide you with everything you need. Bo Maddox has prospects, father. He has integrity, skills, and the kind of character that builds lasting success. The same qualities you had when mother chose you. And if I'm wrong about him? If he proves to be nothing more than a charming drifter who sees you as his path to easy living? Vivienne thought of Beau's careful attention to his tools, his patient teaching, the way he spoke of land and livestock with the reverence of a man who understood their true value. Then I'll face the consequences of my choice, just as mother faced the consequences of hers. Edmund studied her face, perhaps seeing something of his younger self in her determined expression. You're going to refuse Harrison's proposal. I already have, in everything but words. And you understand what that means for your inheritance, your position in society, your future security. I understand that some things matter more than security, father. You understood that once too, when you courted a schoolteacher whose family thought you weren't good enough for her. The parallel was too obvious to ignore, and Edmund's laugh held more pain than humor. Your mother would have been proud of your courage, even if she might have questioned your judgment. Will you meet him? Beau, I mean. Actually speak with him before you condemn what we're building together. Edmund was quiet for so long that Vivienne began to think he would refuse. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weariness of a man who had spent years making decisions based on fear rather than hope. Bring him to dinner tomorrow night. I'll listen to what he has to say. And Harrison? I'll inform Mr. Whitfield that the engagement he assumed was forthcoming will not be taking place. Let him direct his matrimonial ambitions elsewhere. As Vivienne left the study, she felt both triumph and terror at the magnitude of what she'd set in motion. Tomorrow night, the two most important men in her life would meet across her father's dinner table, and the outcome would determine whether she spent her future building something meaningful or rebuilding bridges she'd burned in pursuit of an impossible dream. That evening at the homestead, she told Beau about the dinner invitation while they shared the meal she'd prepared, a beef stew that had actually turned out edible, thanks to his patient instruction over the past weeks. Your father wants to take my measure, Beau observed, showing no sign of intimidation at the prospect. He wants to understand why I'm willing to give up everything I've inherited for the possibility of building something with you. And what will you tell him if he asks you directly? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications they'd been dancing around for weeks. Vivienne set down her spoon and looked into those steady grey eyes that had become so familiar and so necessary to her sense of peace. I'll tell him that I've fallen in love with a man who sees me for who I am rather than what I represent. A man who's teaching me that real security comes from being valued completely, not from being provided for grudgingly. The words seemed to surprise them both with their simple honesty. Beau reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles across her knuckles. And I'll tell him that I love his daughter enough to spend my life proving she made the right choice, even if it means starting over with nothing but our two pairs of hands and the determination to build something worthy of her courage. When he leaned across the table to kiss her, the gesture felt like a promise being sealed, rather than a moment of stolen romance. The future they were contemplating might be uncertain, but the foundation they were building together felt as solid as the cabin walls surrounding them. As they held each other in the lamplight, surrounded by the tools and evidence of their shared work, Vivienne felt the same sense of completion her mother must have experienced when she chose love over convention all those years ago. Tomorrow night would bring its own challenges, but tonight belonged to the quiet certainty that they were building something together that would last long after the doubters had moved on to other scandals. The dinner that would determine Vivienne's future began with an unexpected discovery that changed everything she thought she knew about the man she loved. While helping Beau prepare for the evening at his modest cabin, she accidentally knocked over his saddlebags, spilling their contents across the rough wooden floor. Among the practical items, spare clothes, shaving implements, a well-worn Bible lay, a leather portfolio she'd never seen before. It had fallen open to reveal official documents bearing military seals and the distinctive letterhead of the United States War Department. "Beau," she called, holding up the papers with curiosity rather than suspicion. "What are these?" He emerged from the back room where he'd been attempting to make his best shirt presentable, took one look at the scattered documents, and went very still. The easy confidence she'd grown accustomed to seemed to drain from his shoulders, replaced by something that looked almost like shame. "Those are things I don't talk about," he said quietly, kneeling to gather the papers with careful hands. But Vivian had already glimpsed enough to understand their significance. The top document was a military discharge, signed by a colonel and dated 1865. More intriguingly, it listed Beau's rank not as a common soldier but as a major, with notations about distinguished service and commendations for valor. "You were an officer," she said, not quite managing to keep the surprise from her voice. "I was a lot of things during the war. Most of them aren't worth remembering." She watched him stack the papers with movements that spoke of long practice in keeping painful memories contained. The revelation that he'd held significant military rank shifted her understanding of his character, but perhaps not in the way he feared. "Why didn't you tell me?" Beau finished securing the documents in their portfolio before meeting her eyes. "Because I've spent the last 15 years trying to forget the man those papers describe. The war made me someone I didn't want to be, and when it ended, I decided to start over as someone else entirely. Someone who fixes barns and splits firewood instead of leading men into battle. Someone who builds things instead of destroying them," he corrected. "Someone who can sleep at night without hearing the screams of boys who followed my orders into places they should never have gone." The pain in his voice was raw enough that she understood this conversation was costing him more than simple embarrassment about his past. She reached for his hands, noting again the scars she'd assumed came from ordinary labor, but now recognized might have different origins. "The war ended 24 years ago, Beau. You were barely more than a boy yourself when it started. Old enough to make decisions that got good men killed. Old enough to carry out orders that still wake me up some nights in a cold sweat." She studied his face, seeing new layers in the quiet strength she'd come to depend on. The controlled competence that made him such an effective teacher and partner suddenly made sense. He'd learned leadership under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. "Is that why you chose this life? Working alone, staying away from responsibilities that might affect other people?" "Partly," he admitted. "I figured I'd done enough damage to last several lifetimes. Better to spend the rest of my years doing work that helped rather than hurt." The admission reframed everything she'd learned about him over the past weeks. His patience with her clumsy attempts at manual labor, his careful attention to safety, his reluctance to make decisions that affected her future. All of it spoke to a man who had learned to value other people's well-being above his own ambitions. "My father will want to know about your military service," she said carefully. "It might actually work in your favor. He respects men who've served their country. And when he learns what kind of service it was, when he discovers that his daughter is in love with a man who spent 4 years perfecting the art of killing." The bitter edge in his voice made her heart ache for the young man who had carried such terrible burdens. She framed his face with her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Then he'll learn that his daughter is in love with a man who survived hell and chose to spend the rest of his life building rather than destroying. A man who turned his back on violence and chose to create something beautiful instead." Beau's expression softened at her words, but the wariness remained. "You don't know everything those papers contain, Vivienne. There are things I did, orders I followed, decisions I made that would change how you see me. Nothing in those documents will change the fact that you've spent weeks teaching me to believe in my own capabilities. Nothing will change the way you handle injured animals or fix broken things with such careful attention. Nothing will change the fact that you've shown me what it means to be truly seen and valued by another person." She kissed him then, putting all her conviction into the contact. When they separated, some of the tension had left his shoulders, though the shadows remained in his grey eyes. "Your father deserves to know what kind of man he's welcoming into his home," Beau said finally. "I won't start this relationship by hiding the most important parts of my past." They arrived at the Ashcroft mansion as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the manicured grounds that had never seemed more artificial to Vivienne. Beau had dressed in his best clothier dark suit that had seen better days, but was clean and well-maintained, and carried himself with a dignity that even her father's intimidating study couldn't diminish. Edmund received them in the parlour, his assessment of Beau both thorough and shrewd. The two men shook hands with the mutual respect of equals, though Vivienne could see her father cataloguing everything from Beau's firm grip to his direct eye contact. "Mr. Maddox," Edmund said, "Vivienne tells me you've been working to restore the homestead property." "Yes, sir. It's good land with solid infrastructure. A few more weeks of work should have it ready for productive use." "And what are your plans for that productivity?" The dinner conversation that followed revealed both men at their most diplomatic. Edmund probed carefully about Beau's background, intentions, and ability to provide for a woman accustomed to considerable luxury. Beau answered with quiet honesty, neither boasting about his capabilities nor apologizing for his circumstances. When the topic of military service arose, Beau made the choice Vivienne had hoped he would. He spoke briefly but candidly about his rank, his service record, and his decision to pursue a different kind of life after the war ended. "A major at such a young age," Edmund observed. "That suggests considerable leadership ability and the trust of your superior officers." "It suggests I was in the right place at the right time and managed not to get myself killed," Beau replied. "The war made soldiers of a lot of boys who might have preferred different circumstances." "Indeed, and yet you chose to put aside that experience in favor of manual labor. I chose to put aside violence in favor of building something useful. There's dignity in honest work, regardless of what kind of work it is." Edmund's slight smile suggested he recognized the echo of his own younger philosophy in Beau's words. "My daughter seems to believe that the two of you are building something significant together." "We are, sir. Something that will last, because it's founded on mutual respect and shared effort rather than convenience or social expectation. And if I were to object to this arrangement, if I were to insist that Vivienne's future lies with someone more suitable to her station," Beau met Edmund's challenge with steady calm. "Then I'd respect your position as her father, while hoping that time might prove the worth of what we're attempting to create together." The answer seemed to satisfy some test Edmund had been conducting. As Rosa served dessert, the older man's questions became less probing and more genuinely curious about the homestead's restoration and Beau's plans for making it self-sufficient. When the evening ended, Edmund walked them to the door with an expression Vivienne couldn't quite read. "Mr. Maddox," he said, extending his hand again, "I appreciate your honesty about your background and intentions. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you, sir. I'd like to visit the homestead sometime soon, see what you've accomplished with the property." "You're welcome any time, Mr. Ashcroft." As they walked toward Vivienne's carriage, she felt cautiously optimistic about the evening's outcome. Her father hadn't given his blessing, but neither had he forbidden the relationship or renewed his ultimatum about marriage to Harrison Whitfield. "That went better than I expected," she said as Beau helped her into the driver's seat. "Your father is a shrewd man, but a fair one. He's willing to let our actions speak louder than his assumptions." "And the military papers? Do you regret telling him?" Beau considered the question as he swung up beside her. "No. If we're going to build something lasting, it has to be founded on truth rather than convenient omissions." As they drove through the moonlit landscape toward the homestead, Vivienne felt the deep satisfaction of having cleared another hurdle in their unconventional courtship. The military documents had revealed new depths to the man she loved, but they'd also shown her father a version of Beau's character that commanded respect rather than suspicion. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as partners who had chosen honesty over convenience, even when the truth carried the weight of old pain and difficult memories. The morning that would reveal the true nature of the forces working against them began with violence. Vivienne arrived at the homestead to find Beau standing in the ruins of what had been their restored barn, his face grim as he surveyed the deliberate destruction that had occurred during the night. The building hadn't simply collapsed, it had been systematically vandalized. Support beams bore the marks of saw cuts. The new roof lay in twisted fragments, and their carefully organized tools had been scattered across the muddy ground. Most ominously, someone had used red paint to scrawl a message across the remaining wall: "Ashcroft's not welcome." "How much of the work can we salvage?" Vivian asked, though she already suspected the answer from Beau's expression. "Most of it will have to be rebuilt from scratch," he replied, kneeling to examine a beam that had been deliberately weakened. "This wasn't random vandalism, Vivienne. Someone spent considerable time and effort making sure we'd have to start over." She walked through the debris, her riding boots crunching on broken glass and scattered nails. The destruction felt personal, as if whoever had done this understood exactly how much the barn had meant to their shared project. Who would do something like this? Someone who wants you to give up on this place and go back to the life they think you should be living, Beau said, straightening with a piece of cut rope in his hands. The question is whether they're acting on their own or following someone else's orders. The answer to that question came 3 hours later, when they discovered that the destruction extended beyond simple vandalism. While Beau worked to secure what could be saved, Vivienne rode into town to report the incident to Sheriff Morrison and purchase replacement supplies. At the general store, she overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. 2 men she didn't recognize were discussing the Ashcroft problem with Harvey Pembroke, the Territorial Land Commissioner, in voices they clearly thought were private. "The railroad syndicate is getting impatient," one of the men was saying. "They've invested considerable money in securing those mining rights, and they won't tolerate much more delay." "Edmund Ashcroft isn't stupid," Pembroke replied. "He's starting to ask questions about the survey reports and the claim filings. If he discovers what we've done, then we make sure he doesn't discover it." The second man interrupted. "The daughter's infatuation with that cowboy provides the perfect distraction. Keep Ashcroft focused on family scandals while we finalize the transfers." Vivienne pressed herself against the store's back wall, her heart pounding as the implications of what she was hearing began to sink in. The men were discussing her family's mining claims as if they were already someone else's property, and her relationship with Beau was being used as a deliberate diversion. "What about the homestead property?" Pembroke asked. "The girl's been spending considerable time out there with her hired man. That land isn't part of the mineral rights package, but it could become a problem if they establish any kind of permanent presence. Better to discourage the romance before it goes too far." Hence the barn incident. A gentle warning that some choices have consequences. If that doesn't work, we'll escalate until she sees reason. Vivienne waited until the men had left before emerging from her hiding place, her mind racing with the magnitude of what she'd discovered. The attacks on the homestead weren't personal. They were part of a larger conspiracy to steal her family's mining claims through legal manipulation and intimidation. She rode back to the homestead with thoughts churning like storm clouds, trying to piece together a plot that seemed to involve territorial officials, railroad interests, and the deliberate use of her romance with Beau as a distraction from more serious crimes. "We need to examine the legal documents," she told Beau as soon as she reached the property. "Something is very wrong with the mining claims, and I think the people responsible are the same ones who destroyed the barn." Beau listened without interruption as she repeated the conversation she'd overheard, his expression growing increasingly serious as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. "This explains why your father was so eager to have you married off quickly," he said when she finished. "If someone's been forging claim documents or manipulating surveys, they'd need him distracted while they completed the theft. Can you help me investigate? Your military experience, you must have dealt with similar situations during the war." "Intelligence gathering and document analysis were part of my responsibilities," Beau confirmed. "But if we're going up against territorial officials and railroad money, we'll need more than suspicions. We'll need proof that will hold up in court." They spent the rest of the day riding to the various mining sites, comparing the actual boundaries with the descriptions in the legal documents Vivienne had retrieved from her father's safe. What they discovered was both more complex and more audacious than simple claim jumping. Someone had been systematically altering survey reports to shift property boundaries in favor of railroad-controlled interests. The changes were subtle a few degrees here, a landmark reference there, but they added up to thousands of acres of mineral-rich land being transferred from legitimate owners to a syndicate that had paid nothing for it. "Look at this," Bo said, pointing to a discrepancy in one of the survey maps. "According to the original filing, your father's claim extends to that ridge line, but the amended version moves the boundary back by nearly a quarter mile." Amended when? 6 months ago, according to the date stamp, right around the time your father started pressuring you about marriage. The pattern was becoming clear. The conspirators had been gradually stealing Ashcroft mining rights while using Edmund's concern about his daughter's future to keep him distracted from business matters. The romance with Bo had provided an even better diversion of family crisis that required immediate attention while the real crime proceeded unnoticed. As evening approached, they returned to the homestead with evidence that would expose the conspiracy, but also with the knowledge that they were now in genuine danger. The destruction of the barn had been a warning. Discovery of their investigation would likely provoke a more serious response. "We need to tell your father immediately," Bo said as they secured the documents in the cabin's hidden compartment. "He has the resources and connections to fight this legally. And we need to be prepared for the possibility that some of those connections are compromised," Vivienne added. "If territorial officials are involved, we can't trust the normal channels of justice." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the window. 3 riders were approaching in the gathering dusk, and Vivienne recognized one of them as Harrison Whitfield. "Company," Bo observed, his hand moving instinctively to the hunting rifle mounted above the fireplace. "Let me handle this," Vivienne said, though her heart was beating fast enough that she wondered if the visitors could hear it. Whitfield dismounted with the confidence of a man who believed he held all the advantages. His companions remained mounted, their hands resting conspicuously on their gun belts. "Vivienne, my dear," Whitfield called, "I've come to discuss your future with you and your hired man." "We have nothing to discuss, Harrison. On the contrary, we have a great deal to discuss, starting with your decision to abandon a suitable marriage in favor of playing house with a vagrant." Bo stepped onto the porch beside her, his presence both protective and stabilizing. "You're on private property, Whitfield. State your business or move along." "My business is with Miss Ashcroft's reputation and her family's good name," Whitfield replied, his voice carrying an ugly edge, "both of which are being damaged by this inappropriate liaison. What Vivienne and I do on her property is none of your concern. Everything that affects the Ashcroft name is my concern, given my business relationships with her father." Whitfield's smile was cold and calculating. "You see, Mr. Maddox, there are aspects of this situation you don't understand. Commercial arrangements that supersede romantic fantasies." The threat was barely veiled, but Vivienne was no longer the naive woman who had propositioned a stranger at a county fair. The evidence they'd gathered that day had shown her exactly what kind of man Harrison Whitfield really was. "I understand more than you think, Harrison," she said quietly, "including your involvement with certain railroad interests and territorial officials." The change in Whitfield's expression confirmed that their investigation had struck close to the truth. His calculated confidence flickered, replaced by something much more dangerous. "I think you should come with me tonight, Vivienne. There are people who would very much like to discuss your recent activities." It was Bo who answered, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had commanded soldiers in combat. "The lady isn't going anywhere with you. I suggest you leave now, before this situation becomes more complicated than you want to handle." The standoff stretched between them like a taut wire, loaded with the potential for violence. Finally, Whitfield remounted his horse, but his parting words carried the weight of a promise rather than a retreat. "This isn't over, Vivienne. There are consequences for the choices you're making, and they extend beyond your personal happiness." As the 3 men rode away into the darkness, Vivienne felt the last of her illusions about her protected position in society crumble away. The conspiracy they'd uncovered was larger and more dangerous than a simple property dispute. It involved powerful men who would use violence to protect their interests, and she and Bo had just declared themselves enemies of forces that could destroy them both. But alongside the fear came a fierce determination that surprised her with its intensity. They had evidence of crimes that affected not just her family but dozens of other property owners. The choice before them was simple: surrender to the corruption or fight for justice, regardless of the personal cost. As Bo secured the cabin for the night, checking windows and loading his rifle with practiced efficiency, Vivienne understood that their quiet romance had evolved into something much larger. They were no longer just two people building a life together. They were partners in a battle that would determine whether truth and justice could prevail against wealth and corruption in the Montana Territory. The next morning brought Edmund Ashcroft to the homestead at a gallop, his face a mask of fury and concern that Vivienne had never seen before. Rosa rode beside him on her old mare, her presence suggesting that whatever had brought them out so early was serious enough to require all possible family support. "Vivienne!" Edmund called as he dismounted. "Thank God you're safe." "Safe from what?" she asked, though the grim set of her father's shoulders suggested she already knew. "Harrison Whitfield came to see me last night. He claimed you and Maddox had threatened him with violence when he tried to discuss your engagement. He's talking about filing charges with the territorial marshal." Bo stepped onto the porch, his rifle cradled in his arms, with casual competence. "He's welcome to file any charges he likes, Mr. Ashcroft. But he might want to consider what kind of scrutiny that would bring to his own activities." Edmund studied the destroyed barn, the scattered debris, and his daughter's determined expression with the assessment of a man who had built his fortune by reading situations quickly and accurately. "Tell me what's really happening here," he said. They brought him inside the cabin, where Vivienne and Bo laid out the evidence they'd gathered: the forged survey documents, the altered claim boundaries, and the overheard conversation that revealed the scope of the conspiracy. As Edmund examined each piece of evidence, his expression grew increasingly thunderous. "These are my mining claims," he said, pointing to one of the altered surveys. "This ridgeline has been moved back nearly half a mile. That represents thousands of dollars in mineral rights." "It gets worse, Father," Vivienne said quietly. "Show him the territorial filing records." The documents Bo had retrieved from the land office told a story of systematic fraud. Claims that had been filed decades earlier were being amended to benefit railroad interests, with the changes backdated to make them appear legitimate. Property that had been in families for generations was being transferred to a syndicate that existed only on paper. "This isn't just theft," Edmund said, his voice deadly quiet. "This is conspiracy to defraud dozens of property owners across 3 territories. The money involved must be enormous. Enough to buy territorial officials, judges, and anyone else who might interfere." Bo agreed, including arranging marriages that would distract wealthy landowners from paying attention to their business interests. The implication hit Edmund like a physical blow. His engagement negotiations with Harrison Whitfield hadn't been about securing his daughter's future. They'd been about ensuring his distraction while his property was systematically stolen. "My God," he breathed. "Catherine would have seen through this immediately. She always could read people better than I could." Rosa, who had been listening in silence, moved to put a protective hand on Vivienne's shoulder. "What do we do now, Signor Edmund? These men will not stop because we have found papers." "We expose them," Edmund said with the determination of a man who had built an empire and wouldn't see it stolen by fraud. "But carefully, and with allies we can trust completely." Over the next several hours, they developed a plan that would require careful timing and considerable courage. The annual Harvest Festival was scheduled for the following weekend, bringing together territorial officials, business leaders, and property owners from across the region. It would provide the perfect opportunity to present their evidence publicly, where the conspirators couldn't suppress or dismiss it quietly. "We'll need people we can trust, absolutely," Edmund said, studying a list of names he'd written on the back of one of the forged documents. "Men whose integrity is beyond question." "Judge Morrison is honest," Bo suggested. "He served with honor during the war, and he's not beholden to railroad interests. Sheriff Davidson from Billings is clean too. Edmund added. He's been investigating some suspicious land transfers in his county. What about the territorial governor? Vivienne asked. Compromised, her father replied immediately. Half his campaign was funded by the same railroad syndicate that's behind this fraud. As they planned their strategy, Rosa kept watch from the windows, her experienced eyes scanning for any sign of unwelcome visitors. The destruction of the barn had been a warning. Their investigation would likely provoke a more serious response. There's something else, Vivienne said when they'd finished outlining their approach. She disappeared into the bedroom and returned with a small wooden box that had belonged to her grandmother. Inside, wrapped in faded velvet, lay a derringer with a pearl handle and brass fittings. Grandmother Ashcroft carried this during the Indian troubles of the 60s, she explained to Beau's questioning look. She said a woman needed to be prepared to defend what mattered most to her. Beau examined the weapon with professional interest. It's well maintained. Do you know how to use it? Rosa taught me when I was 16. Father thought it was unseemly, but Mother insisted. Smart woman, Beau said, checking the gun's action before returning it to her. Keep it with you from now on. These men have too much to lose to worry about the niceties of threatening a lady. That evening, as Edmund and Rosa returned to town to begin quietly contacting their trusted allies, Vivienne and Beau sat together on the cabin's porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The peaceful scene belied the danger they would face in the coming days. Are you afraid? She asked, her hand finding his in the gathering darkness. Afraid of losing you, he admitted. Afraid of failing to protect what we've built together, but not afraid of fighting men who think they can steal from honest people. I've never felt more alive than I have these past weeks, Vivienne said. Working beside you, learning from you, discovering what I'm capable of when I stop accepting other people's limitations. Whatever happens at the festival, I want you to know that you've given me exactly what you promised, life I can feel in my bones. Beau's kiss tasted of determination and promises that went deeper than words. When they separated, his hand traced the line of her jaw with gentle reverence. When this is over, Vivienne, I want to marry you properly. Not because of some arrangement or social expectation, but because I can't imagine a future that doesn't include building something lasting together. Yes, she said without hesitation. But first, we have a conspiracy to expose and justice to serve. The next morning brought news that complicated their plans considerably. Sheriff Morrison arrived with word that Harrison Whitfield had indeed filed charges, claiming that Beau had threatened him with violence and that Vivienne was being held against her will at the homestead. It's obviously false, Morrison said, studying the evidence they'd assembled. But it gives them legal justification for whatever action they want to take. They could send a marshal out here with a warrant. Or worse, Beau added grimly. They could claim I resisted arrest and handle the problem more permanently. Edmund arrived an hour later with reinforcements, 3 of his most trusted mining foremen, all armed and all committed to protecting his daughter and her chosen partner. The sight of honest men prepared to stand against corruption gave Vivienne hope that justice might actually prevail. Judge Morrison has agreed to hear our evidence, Edmund reported. Sheriff Davidson is bringing similar documentation from his county. If we can present a united front at the festival, we might be able to expose this conspiracy before they can cover their tracks. And if we can't, Vivienne asked. Then we fight, her father replied, with the grim determination of a man who had fought his way up from poverty and wouldn't be driven back down by fraud. We fight with everything we have, because some things are worth more than safety. As they made final preparations for the confrontation that would determine their futures, Vivienne tucked her grandmother's derringer into her skirt pocket and checked its load one more time. The weight of the small weapon served as a tangible reminder that she was no longer the sheltered heiress who had propositioned a stranger at a county fair. She was a woman prepared to fight for the man she loved, the justice they deserved, and the future they were determined to build together, regardless of the powerful forces arrayed against them. The battle ahead would test everything they'd learned about themselves and each other, but it would also prove whether love and courage could triumph over corruption and greed. The festival was 3 days away. In that time, they would need to gather their allies, secure their evidence, and prepare for a confrontation that would either expose the conspiracy or destroy them all. As Vivienne watched Beau check his rifle one more time, she felt the same mixture of terror and exhilaration she'd experienced when she first walked across that dusty fairground to speak her heart to a stranger. Some choices, she realized, were worth any risk. Some futures were worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed impossible. And some loves were strong enough to face down the worst that powerful men could devise. The Harvest Festival would be their moment of truth. Everything they'd built together, their partnership, their love, their shared vision of justice, would be tested in a public arena where failure meant losing not just their future, but possibly their lives. But as she felt the solid weight of her grandmother's derringer and the steady presence of the man beside her, Vivienne Ashcroft had never been more certain that she was exactly where she belonged, fighting for exactly what mattered most. The Harvest Festival dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline light that made the Montana mountains look sharp enough to cut glass. By noon, the fairgrounds teemed with families who had traveled from homesteads and ranches scattered across hundreds of miles, all gathered to celebrate another year of survival in territory that demanded everything from those who called it home. Vivienne stood on the main platform beside Judge Morrison, watching the crowd gather around the gazebo where the festival's official ceremonies would take place. In her hands, she held the leather portfolio containing the original town charter, the document that would prove the railroad syndicate's claims were built on forgery and fraud. The charter had been discovered in the territorial archives by Sheriff Davidson, buried beneath decades of routine paperwork, but clearly establishing the legal boundaries that predated all the suspicious amendments. More importantly, it contained signatures and seals that could be verified against other official documents, providing irrefutable evidence of the conspiracy's scope. "Are you ready for this?" Judge Morrison asked quietly, his weathered face grave with the weight of what they were about to attempt. "As ready as anyone can be to accuse half the territorial government of fraud," Vivienne replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Across the crowd, she could see Beau positioned near the platform's rear steps, his military training evident in the way he scanned for potential threats while appearing to casually observe the festivities. Edmund stood with Sheriff Davidson and 3 other honest lawmen, their presence both protective and symbolic proof that some officials still valued justice over profit. Harrison Whitfield held court near the bandstand, surrounded by men Vivienne now recognized as key figures in the conspiracy. Territorial Land Commissioner Pembroke was there, along with Railroad Syndicate Representative James Crawford and at least 2 other officials whose corruption the evidence would expose. They moved through the crowd with the confident ease of men who believed they controlled every important outcome. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Morrison called, his voice carrying easily across the fairgrounds, "if I might have your attention for the festival's opening remarks." The crowd quieted expectantly, families gathering closer to hear the traditional words of welcome and celebration. What they would hear instead was a revelation that would shake the territory's power structure to its foundations. "We gather today not just to celebrate our harvest," the judge began, "but to confront a cancer that has been growing in our midst. Evidence has come to light of systematic fraud perpetrated against property owners throughout this territory." The change in the crowd was immediate and electric. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, heads turned toward the platform, and a murmur of confusion and concern rippled through the assembly. Whitfield stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "This is highly irregular, Judge Morrison. The festival is hardly the appropriate venue for unsubstantiated accusations." "On the contrary," Morrison replied, his voice carrying the authority of 30 years on the bench. "When fraud affects dozens of families and involves public officials, the public has a right to hear the evidence." Vivienne stepped forward, the portfolio clutched in her hands like a weapon. "My name is Vivienne Ashcroft, and 3 weeks ago, I discovered that mining claims legally owned by my family were being systematically transferred to railroad interests through forged documents and fraudulent surveys. The crowd's murmur grew louder, punctuated by shouts of recognition from property owners who had experienced similar problems with their claims. She could see faces in the audience beginning to connect with her words, ranchers who had lost grazing rights, miners whose claims had been mysteriously amended, homesteaders whose boundaries had been altered without their knowledge. "These are serious accusations," called Commissioner Pembroke, pushing through the crowd toward the platform. "I demand to see the evidence before this witch hunt proceeds any further." "The evidence is right here," Vivian replied, opening the portfolio to reveal the original town charter. This document, filed with the Territorial Archives in 1867, establishes the legal boundaries that your amended surveys have systematically violated. She began reading from the charter, her clear voice carrying the specific legal descriptions that contradicted every forged document the conspirators had filed. With each boundary reference, more members of the crowd began shouting recognition their land, their claims, their property rights had all been affected by the systematic fraud. Bo had moved closer to the platform, his hand resting casually on the rifle slung across his shoulder. His military experience was evident in the way he positioned himself to cover multiple approaches while maintaining the appearance of relaxed attention. "This is preposterous," Whitfield declared, mounting the platform steps with aggressive confidence. "A disgruntled heiress and her hired gun cannot be allowed to disrupt legitimate business with wild conspiracy theories." "Then perhaps you can explain this." Sheriff Davidson called, producing another document from his coat. "A letter in your handwriting, Mr. Whitfield, discussing the timing of survey amendments with Commissioner Pembroke." The letter's existence clearly surprised the conspirators. Whitfield's confident expression flickered, while Pembroke went pale with the realization that their private correspondence had been preserved as evidence. "Where did you get that?" Pembroke demanded. "From your own files, Commissioner. Amazing what can be found when honest lawmen are motivated to look." The crowd was becoming increasingly agitated as the scope of the fraud became clear. Property owners who had lost land, miners whose claims had been reduced, ranchers whose grazing rights had been transferred all began to understand that their individual problems were part of a much larger conspiracy. "This ends now," Crawford, the railroad representative, announced with cold authority. "I'm placing Miss Ashcroft and her accomplices under citizen's arrest for making false accusations against territorial officials." He gestured to several men positioned throughout the crowd, hard-faced individuals who were clearly not local farmers or ranchers. Their hands moved toward concealed weapons as they began pushing through the assembly toward the platform. It was then that Bo's military training became crucial. "Get down!" he shouted to Vivian, bringing his rifle to bear on the nearest threat. The confrontation exploded into chaos as the conspirators' hired guns revealed themselves and honest citizens realized they were witnessing an attempted coup. The evidence they'd gathered was so damning that the corrupt officials were willing to use violence to prevent its public exposure. Judge Morrison grabbed the town charter from Vivian's hands and held it high above his head. "This document proves everything," he shouted over the growing tumult. "The railroad syndicate has been stealing your land through forgery and bribery." A gunshot cracked across the fairgrounds, and Vivienne felt the derringer's weight in her pocket as she realized that the battle for justice had begun in earnest. The peaceful harvest celebration had become a battleground where the future of the territory and her life with Bo would be decided by courage, evidence, and the determination of honest people to defend what was rightfully theirs. The gunshot that shattered the morning air came from one of Crawford's hired men, aimed not at any person but at the documents in Judge Morrison's hands. The bullet tore through the original town charter, sending fragments of the precious evidence scattering across the platform like autumn leaves. "The evidence is destroyed," Whitfield shouted triumphantly. "Without those documents, you have nothing but wild accusations." But Vivienne had learned more than domestic skills during her weeks with Bo. She had also learned the value of preparation and backup plans. With calm determination that surprised even herself, she reached into her jacket and produced a second leather portfolio. "Actually, Mr. Whitfield, we have copies of everything. Sheriff Davidson was thorough enough to photograph the original documents before we brought them here." The crowd's roar of approval was deafening. Property owners who had been systematically cheated surged toward the platform. Their anger focused on the men who had stolen their livelihoods through legal manipulation and bribery. Crawford's hired guns found themselves vastly outnumbered by honest ranchers and miners who were armed, angry, and finally understood the scope of the conspiracy that had been working against them. The tactical situation shifted dramatically as Bo's military experience became evident in his coordination of the crowd's defensive positions. "Form up behind the platform," he called to the honest citizens. "Don't let them reach the evidence." But the conspirators weren't finished. As the crowd organized itself for defense, Harrison Whitfield produced a legal document that he waved above his head like a battle flag. "I have a territorial warrant for the arrest of Vivian Ashcroft and Bo Maddox on charges of threatening a territorial official and conspiring to defraud the railroad syndicate." "That warrant is fraudulent," Judge Morrison declared. "I should know they forged my signature on it." The revelation that the conspirators had even corrupted legal documents sent a fresh wave of outrage through the crowd. But it also gave Crawford's men the pretext they needed to escalate their violence. "Resist, arrest, and face the consequences," Crawford shouted, drawing his pistol. The battle that followed would be remembered in territorial history as the moment when honest citizens stood up against systematic corruption and won. Bo's rifle spoke first, his shot carefully aimed to disarm rather than kill, but his military precision sent a clear message that the conspirators faced opponents who knew exactly what they were doing. Edmund Ashcroft and his mining foreman formed a protective circle around the platform, their weapons trained on anyone who threatened his daughter or the evidence she carried. Sheriff Davidson and his deputies moved through the crowd, identifying and isolating the hired guns who had been positioned to intimidate honest witnesses. In the midst of the chaos, Vivian felt a hand grab her wrist with painful force. She turned to find Harrison Whitfield behind her, his face twisted with desperation and rage. "You've destroyed everything," he snarled, dragging her toward the edge of the platform. "Years of careful planning, ruined by one spoiled girl who couldn't accept her proper place." "My proper place," she replied, reaching for her grandmother's derringer, "is standing beside the man I love, fighting for justice." The small weapon appeared in her hand with surprising steadiness, its pearl handle warm against her palm. Whitfield's eyes widened as he realized that the pampered heiress he'd tried to intimidate had become someone entirely different. "You won't shoot me," he said, but his voice carried more hope than conviction. "I won't need to," she replied calmly. Bo's approach from behind was silent as shadow, his military training evident in movements that covered ground without sound. When he spoke, his voice carried the cold authority of a man who had commanded soldiers in life-and-death situations. "Release her, Whitfield, now." "The cowboy comes to rescue his lady," Whitfield sneered, but his grip on Vivienne's wrist loosened slightly. "I'm not here to rescue anyone," Bo replied. "She's perfectly capable of handling herself. I'm here to make sure you understand the consequences of your choices." The confrontation lasted perhaps 10 seconds, but it felt like an eternity suspended between violence and resolution. Finally, Whitfield released Vivian's wrist and stepped back, his hands raised in surrender. "This isn't over," he said, but the words carried no conviction. "Yes, it is," Judge Morrison declared from the platform's center, holding aloft the copies of the evidence that had survived Crawford's desperate attempt at destruction. These documents prove systematic fraud involving territorial officials, railroad representatives, and corrupt businessmen. Arrest warrants will be issued within the hour. The crowd's celebration was thunderous but controlled, channeled by Bo's strategic thinking into protective formations that ensured the evidence remained secure. Sheriff Davidson and his honest deputies began the process of arresting the conspirators, while property owners organized themselves to reclaim the land that had been stolen through fraud. As the immediate crisis passed, Vivian found herself standing beside Bo in the center of a victory that neither of them had been certain they would survive. The battle for justice had been won through courage, preparation, and the determination of honest people to defend their rights. "It's over," she said, hardly believing the words herself. "The legal battle is over," Bo agreed, his arm circling her waist with protective warmth. "But our real work is just beginning." "What do you mean?" He gestured toward the crowd of property owners who were already organizing themselves to rebuild what had been stolen, to restore what had been corrupted, and to ensure that such systematic fraud could never again take root in their territory. "We have a homestead to finish rebuilding," he said, "a life to build together, a future that's finally ours to determine." As they walked together through the celebrating crowd, surrounded by honest people who had found the courage to stand up for justice, Vivian felt the deep satisfaction of having chosen correctly when she walked across a dusty fairground to speak her heart to a stranger. The man who had promised to give her a life she could feel in her bones had delivered exactly that, a partnership based on mutual respect, shared courage, and the determination to build something lasting together. The corrupt officials who had tried to steal their future now faced prison, while she and Bo faced the prospect of marriage, children, and a homestead that would stand as proof that love and justice could triumph over the worst that powerful men could devise. In her pocket, her grandmother's derringer was warm against her palm, a reminder that she had become someone strong enough to protect what mattered most. But in her heart, she carried something even more powerful, the absolute certainty that she had found her proper place in the world, standing beside a man who saw her completely and loved her anyway. 6 months later, the April morning that would complete Vivian's transformation from sheltered heiress to partner in a working ranch dawned with the kind of golden light that made the Montana territory look like a promise kept. She stood in the doorway of the rebuilt barn, one hand resting on her gently rounded belly, watching Bo work with the pregnant mare they'd purchased with the compensation money recovered from the conspiracy trials. The homestead had been transformed beyond recognition. Where once stood a neglected property gathering dust, now thrived a working ranch that served as home to the couple who had fought corrupt officials and won. The barn was larger and sturdier than its predecessor, built with materials bought through legal channels rather than stolen through fraud. The house had been expanded to include a nursery, where the first of those strong sons she'd once requested would soon sleep peacefully. But the most remarkable change was in Vivienne herself. Gone were the elaborate dresses and uncomfortable social expectations that had once defined her identity. She wore practical work clothes now. Her hands bore the honest calluses of someone who contributed equally to their shared enterprise, and her auburn hair was braided in a style that wouldn't interfere with the business of living. "The mare's restless," Bo observed, approaching with the gentle smile that still made her heart flutter, even after months of marriage. "I think we'll have a foal before nightfall." "Just like our own little one," she replied, taking his offered hand and feeling the familiar warmth of a connection that had only deepened with time and shared challenges. "Dr. Martinez thinks another few weeks." They walked together toward the house, past the garden, where Rosa tended vegetables with the satisfaction of someone finally free to nurture growth rather than merely maintain appearances. The older woman had chosen to join them at the homestead, claiming that someone needed to teach the next generation of Ashcrofts the practical skills their parents were still learning. Inside, Edmund sat at the kitchen table with ledger books spread before him, his transformation perhaps even more remarkable than his daughter's. The man who had once valued only profit and social position had discovered the satisfaction of building something meaningful with his family, rather than merely accumulating wealth to impress strangers. "The mining claims are producing better than we expected," he reported, looking up from calculations that represented honest prosperity rather than stolen assets. "The new equipment we ordered should arrive by summer." The conspiracy trials had resulted in prison sentences for Harrison Whitfield, Commissioner Pembroke, and a dozen other officials who had participated in the systematic fraud. More importantly, they had led to reforms that protected property owners throughout the territory from similar schemes. The Ashcroft name, once synonymous with wealth and social prominence, had become associated with integrity and justice. "I have something for you," Beau said to Vivienne, producing a wooden cradle from the workshop where he'd been spending his evenings. The craftsmanship was exquisitely smooth joints, careful proportions, and decorative carving that spoke of love translated into tangible form. She traced the carved pattern with wondering fingers, recognizing the entwined vines and flowers that represented growth, fertility, and the interweaving of two lives into something stronger than either could achieve alone. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Our child will sleep surrounded by the love that created it. Just as you've slept surrounded by the love that helped us survive everything we've faced together," Beau replied, his hand covering hers on the smooth wood. The cradle represented more than furniture, was proof that they had successfully built the life she'd dreamed of when she first spoke her bold request at the county fair. The strong sons she'd asked for would indeed come, but they would grow up in a home founded on mutual respect rather than financial convenience, surrounded by examples of parents who had chosen love over safety and integrity over profit. That evening, as the pregnant mare finally delivered a healthy foal in the barn they'd rebuilt together, Vivienne understood that her mother's letters had been prophetic in ways Catherine Ashcroft could never have imagined. Real security did indeed come from being loved completely rather than provided for grudgingly, but it also came from the confidence that partnership could overcome any challenge. "Do you ever regret it?" Beau asked as they watched the newborn foal struggle to its feet on unsteady legs. "Giving up the comfortable life you were born to for this uncertain adventure?" She considered the question seriously, thinking of the silk dresses she no longer wore, the social gatherings she no longer attended, the safe predictability she had abandoned in favor of building something real. "I regret nothing," she said finally. "I asked you to give me strong sons, and you gave me something infinitely more valuable, a chance to become someone strong enough to be their mother." The foal finally found its balance and took its first tentative steps, a perfect metaphor for the new life they had created together. Like the young horse, their future might be uncertain, but it was entirely their own to determine. As they walked back to the house under stars that seemed close enough to touch, Vivienne felt the baby move within her and smiled at the realization that the cycle was beginning again. Soon there would be another Ashcroft to teach the difference between inheriting a life and building one, between accepting what others decided was appropriate and having the courage to create something better. The wooden spoon she'd carved months earlier still held a place of honor in their kitchen, a reminder that she was capable of creating useful beauty with her own hands. Her grandmother's derringer remained in its special box, no longer needed for protection, but preserved as a reminder that some things were worth fighting for. And somewhere in Edmund's study, her mother's wedding ring waited to be passed down to a daughter who had finally understood what it meant to choose love over convention. The homestead that had begun as a desperate attempt to escape social expectations had evolved into proof that two people with shared values and complementary strengths could indeed build something lasting. The man who had promised to give her a life she could feel in her bones had delivered exactly that, a partnership so complete that she could no longer imagine existing without it. And in the distance, the lights of Larkspur Junction twinkled like earthbound stars, reminding her that they were part of a larger community that had learned the difference between leaders who served their own interests and those who fought for justice. The territory was better for their courage, just as they were better for having found each other. As they prepared for sleep in the home they had built together, surrounded by evidence of their shared accomplishments and anticipating the arrival of the child who would carry their legacy forward, Vivienne reflected on the chain of choices that had brought them to this moment of perfect contentment. It had all begun with a desperate woman walking across a dusty fairground to speak the truest words she'd ever said to a complete stranger. It had continued with that stranger's promise to give her more than she had asked for. And it would go on for decades to come, as they raised children who understood that real strength came from integrity, that genuine security came from love, and that the best legacy anyone could leave was the courage to build something better than what they had inherited. The baby's first gentle kick against her ribs felt like a promise of continuation, of hope, and of the endless possibility that emerged when two people committed themselves completely to creating a future worthy of their love.